The letter arrived just after sunrise, carried by a rider whose horse was still breathing hard from the road. Clara Bennett was kneeling by the hearth, trying to coax a small flame from wet wood, when the knock came so sharp and sudden that she nearly dropped the iron poker in her hand. She was not used to visitors, and she was certainly not used to a rider in a fine gray coat standing at her broken gate with a sealed envelope in his gloved hand. "Are you Clara Bennett, the seamstress?" the man asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I am," she said, wiping ash from her fingers onto her apron, before she dared touch the paper he offered her. The seal was pressed in dark red wax, and even before she broke it, she recognized the mark stamped into it, a hawk with wings spread wide. It was the crest of the Ashworth family, the same crest she had seen painted on the side of carriages that rushed through the village without ever stopping, the same crest stitched into banners that hung from the tall iron gates of the manor on the hill. Everyone in the village knew that crest. Few had ever stood close enough to touch it. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the letter. Inside, the handwriting was neat and commanding, each word placed with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted that his instructions would be obeyed. "You are summoned to Ashworth Manor at once. Bring your sewing tools. Speak of this to no one. A carriage will collect you within the hour." Signed, Duke Edmund Ashworth. Clara read it twice, then a third time, searching for some explanation hidden between the lines, but there was none. No reason given. No warning of what awaited her. Just an order, wrapped in perfect politeness, the kind of politeness that left no room for refusal. She looked up at the rider, who was already turning his horse back toward the road.
"Wait," she said. "What does he want with me?"
The rider did not slow down. "That is not something I am permitted to say, miss. The carriage will arrive shortly. I suggest you be ready." And then he was gone, hooves pounding against the dirt path, leaving Clara standing alone in her doorway, with a letter that felt far too heavy for a single sheet of paper. She stepped back inside her small cottage, her mind racing faster than she could organize her thoughts. The cottage was quiet, except for the soft, uneven breathing coming from the corner bed, where her younger brother Oliver lay curled beneath a thin blanket, his face pale, his lips slightly cracked from the fever that had gripped him for nearly 2 weeks now. The physician in the village had given her a bottle of medicine that cost more than she earned in a month, and even that had only slowed the illness, not cured it. She had spent every coin she owned. She had sold the small silver locket that once belonged to her mother. She had nothing left to sell, and Oliver still burned with fever every night. She knelt beside him and brushed his damp hair back from his forehead. "I have to go somewhere," she whispered. "Just for a little while. Mrs. Doyle from next door will look in on you." Elvira's eyes fluttered open, glassy and tired. "Where?" "To the manor, on the hill," she said, and even as the words left her mouth, they sounded strange, as though she were speaking about a place that only existed in old stories told to children before bed. "I do not know why, but whatever it is, Oliver, it might be enough to pay for the medicine you need. It might be enough to finally make you well." He gave her a small, weak smile, the kind that broke her heart more than any illness ever could. "Be careful, Clara." "I always am," she said, though in truth, she had never faced anything like this before. By the time she had gathered her sewing basket, her spools of thread, her sharpest needles, and her best pair of scissors, wrapped carefully in a cloth so they would not rattle during the ride, the carriage was already waiting outside. It was black, trimmed with gold, pulled by 2 horses so well groomed that Clara felt embarrassed by her own patched dress and worn boots standing beside them. The driver did not speak to her. He simply opened the door, waited for her to climb inside, and then shut it firmly behind her, as though sealing her into another world entirely. The ride to the manor took nearly an hour, though it felt far longer. Clara pressed her face close to the small window, watching the familiar fields of her village fade behind her, replaced slowly by tall iron fences, manicured hedges, and finally, the manor itself rising into view like something carved from stone and shadow. It was larger than she had imagined, even after a lifetime of glimpsing its rooftops from a distance. Gray towers stretched upward, framed by a sky that seemed to grow darker the closer they came, though it was still only mid-morning. Ivy climbed along one entire wing of the building, thick and untrimmed, giving that section a wild, neglected look that stood in strange contrast to the rest of the manor's careful grandeur. Clara noticed that the windows on that far wing were shuttered tight, every single one of them, while the rest of the house glittered with clean glass and open curtains. The carriage came to a stop in front of towering double doors, and before Clara could even gather her basket properly, one of the doors opened, revealing a tall woman dressed in black, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her face. Her expression was unreadable, neither warm nor unkind, simply watchful. "You must be the seamstress," the woman said. "I am Mrs. Doyle, housekeeper of this manor. The Duke is expecting you." Clara blinked. "Doyle? That is my neighbor's name as well." "A common enough name," Mrs. Doyle replied, though something flickered briefly across her face, gone before Clara could be certain she had seen it at all. "Come. He does not like to be kept waiting. And today of all days, his patience is thinner than usual." Clara followed her inside, her worn boots echoing strangely against the polished stone floor. The entrance hall alone was larger than her entire cottage, lined with paintings of stern-faced men and women, who all seemed to share the same sharp eyes and firm jaw, the Ashworth bloodline staring down at her from gilded frames, as though judging whether she belonged there at all. Clara kept her gaze low, clutching her sewing basket tightly against her chest, feeling smaller with every step. They passed servants in the hallway, all of whom offered quick, careful glances before looking away just as fast. One young maid, carrying a stack of folded linens, actually stopped mid-step when she saw Clara, her eyes widening slightly, before Mrs. Doyle cleared her throat sharply, and the maid hurried on without a word. "Is something wrong?" Clara asked quietly. "Everything in this house is fine," Mrs. Doyle said, in a tone that suggested the opposite. They stopped in front of a heavy wooden door near the end of a long corridor. Mrs. Doyle knocked twice, waited for a low voice to respond from within, and then opened the door just enough to allow Clara through. "The seamstress has arrived, Your Grace." "Send her in, leave us." Mrs. Doyle stepped aside, gesturing for Clara to enter, and then closed the door behind her the moment she crossed the threshold, leaving Clara alone, in a room that smelled faintly of old paper, polished wood, and something else she could not quite name. Something like the smell of a place that had not been properly aired out in a very long time. The study was dim, lit only by a fire crackling in a stone hearth, and a single lamp on a heavy desk. Shelves of books climbed from floor to ceiling along every wall, and thick curtains covered the windows, blocking out whatever daylight might have otherwise found its way inside. And there, standing near the fireplace with his back partially turned, was a man Clara recognized immediately, though she had never once seen him this close before. Duke Edmund Ashworth was younger than she had expected, though his face carried a weariness that made him seem far older than his years. His dark hair was neatly combed but slightly too long at the edges, as though grooming had become a task he no longer had the patience for. His clothes were fine, tailored perfectly to his frame, yet somehow, they hung on him the way clothes hang on a man who has lost weight he never meant to lose. When he finally turned to face her, Clara felt her breath catch, not because of his appearance, though he was handsome in a severe, guarded way, but because of his eyes. They held an emptiness she recognized instantly, the same hollow look she had seen in her own reflection during the worst nights of Oliver's fever, the look of someone carrying a grief too heavy to set down. "You are the seamstress from the village," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace. Clara Bennett." He studied her for a long moment, long enough that she felt heat rise in her cheeks under the weight of his gaze. "They tell me you are skilled, that your stitches are the finest this county has seen in years. I do my best work, Your Grace." "Your best work will need to be extraordinary," he said, turning to face the fire once more. "What I am about to ask of you is not ordinary. I must know now, before I say another word, whether you are the kind of woman who can keep a secret, a true secret, the kind that does not slip out over supper or between friends over tea." Clara's heart pounded, though she kept her voice steady. "I have kept far heavier things to myself than gossip, Your Grace. My silence is not for sale, but it is reliable." Something in his expression shifted then, not quite a smile, but a small loosening of the tension around his mouth. "Good," he said, "because what I need you to make for me is not simply a dress. It is a memory. And memories, Miss Bennett, can be far more dangerous than anyone realizes." He walked slowly to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room, retrieved a small brass key from inside his coat, and opened it with careful, almost reverent hands. From within, he lifted out a folded portrait wrapped in soft cloth, along with several small fragments of pale ivory fabric, delicate and clearly very old, their edges frayed with time. "This was my wife," he said quietly, setting the portrait down on the desk where the lamplight could reach it. "Isabel. She has been gone 2 years now, and I need you to recreate the dress she wore on the day we were married, using nothing but this portrait and these fragments of the original cloth. Every stitch, every fold, exactly as it was." Clara stepped closer, studying the painted image of a woman with soft brown curls and a gentle, knowing smile, dressed in a gown so intricate it made Clara's fingers twitch with both excitement and dread. It was beautiful work, delicate lace layered over silk, tiny pearls sewn along the bodice in a pattern that would take days, perhaps weeks, of careful, exhausting labor to replicate. "May I ask why, Your Grace?" she said carefully. "If this is a memory of your late wife, surely there are seamstresses far closer to your own household who could attempt such delicate work." His jaw tightened. "You may not ask why, not yet, perhaps not ever. What you may ask is whether you are willing to accept the commission, and whether you understand that once you begin, you cannot simply walk away from it." Clara hesitated only a moment, thinking of Oliver's fevered face, of the empty medicine bottle sitting on the table beside his bed, of the silver locket she had already sold and could never buy back. She thought of the weight of that letter that morning, and the strange feeling that had followed her the entire ride to this manor, a feeling that told her something important was about to change in her life, whether she chose it or not. "I accept, Your Grace," she said. "I will make the dress." The Duke studied her once more, and for the briefest instant, something like relief passed behind his tired eyes. "Then we begin tomorrow," he said. "You will stay here at the manor until the work is complete. A room has already been prepared for you. And payment, Your Grace. You will be paid more than you have ever earned in your life, Miss Bennet, that I promise you." He paused, his gaze drifting briefly toward the locked cabinet, toward the shuttered wing of the house Clara had noticed from the carriage window. "But I must warn you of one thing, and I need you to remember it every single day you remain under this roof." "What is that, Your Grace?" "Do not go near the west wing," he said, his voice dropping low, almost a whisper. "No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, some doors in this house were locked for a reason, and I would not wish that reason upon anyone, least of all a woman who has done nothing but agree to help me." Clara felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine, though the fire crackled warmly only a few steps away. She nodded, unable to find any words that felt adequate to answer such a warning, and as Mrs. Doyle appeared at the door once more to lead her to her room, Clara could not shake the feeling that she had just agreed to something far larger and far stranger than a simple commission to sew a dress. Behind her, as she stepped into the corridor, she thought she heard the faintest sound drifting from somewhere deep within the manor, somewhere past the long hallway and the locked doors of the west wing. It was soft, almost impossible to be certain of, but it sounded, for just a moment, like the quiet, distant cry of a woman. Clara turned to look, but the corridor behind her was empty, and Mrs. Doyle was already walking briskly ahead, as though she had heard nothing at all. The room Mrs. Doyle led Clara to was larger than anything she had ever slept in, with a tall canopy bed, a wash basin of real porcelain, and a window that looked out over gardens so neatly trimmed they seemed almost unreal, like something painted rather than grown. Clara stood in the doorway for a long moment before she could bring herself to step inside, half expecting someone to appear and tell her there had been a mistake, that a room like this could not possibly be meant for a village seamstress. "You will find everything you need here," Mrs. Doyle said, setting a small stack of folded linens on the edge of the bed. "A bath will be drawn for you shortly. Supper is served at 7, though His Grace rarely joins the table these days. You will most likely eat alone, or with the staff if you prefer company." "Thank you," Clara said, still looking around the room in quiet disbelief. "Mrs. Doyle, may I ask you something?" The housekeeper's hands paused briefly over the linens. "You may ask. I cannot promise an answer." "The West Wing," Clara said carefully. "His Grace warned me not to go near it. What is kept there?" For a moment, Mrs. Doyle's composed expression cracked, just slightly, just enough for Clara to catch a flicker of something underneath, something that looked almost like fear. Then it was gone, smoothed over as quickly as it had appeared. "Nothing that concerns you, Miss Bennet. I would advise you to focus on your work and leave the rest of this house alone." That is the wisest thing anyone has ever told me, and I offer it to you freely." She left without another word, closing the door softly behind her, and Clara was alone with nothing but the crackle of a small fire in the corner hearth and the strange, heavy silence of a house that seemed to be holding its breath. That night, sleep came slowly. Clara lay beneath blankets softer than anything she owned, staring up at a ceiling painted with faint gold patterns, and she thought of Oliver back in the cottage, hopefully resting peacefully under Mrs. Doyle from the village's watchful eye. She thought of the Duke's tired, hollow eyes, and the way his voice had dropped when he spoke of the West Wing, as though even mentioning it cost him something. And she thought, more than once, of that faint sound she had heard in the corridor, the one that sounded almost like a woman crying, though she told herself firmly that it had simply been the wind moving through old stone walls, nothing more. She woke early the next morning to the sound of birds outside her window and a soft knock at her door. A young maid entered, carrying a tray of bread, fruit, and tea, and informed her that His Grace wished to see her in the study within the hour. Clara ate quickly, dressed in her simplest work clothes, and gathered her sewing basket, feeling a strange mixture of nerves and purpose settle over her as she made her way through the quiet corridors. The Duke was waiting for her in the study, standing beside a long table that had not been there the day before. Spread across it were the fragments of ivory fabric she had seen briefly in the cabinet, along with several bolts of new material in similar shades, clearly gathered in preparation for the work ahead. The portrait of Isabel Ashworth had been propped up at one end of the table, her painted eyes seeming to watch over the entire room. "I have gathered what materials I could find that might match the original fabric," the Duke said, gesturing toward the table. "Whatever else you require, name it, and it will be brought to you." Clara approached the table slowly, running her fingers gently over the aged fragments, feeling the delicate weave beneath her fingertips. It was fine work, finer than anything she had ever handled before, and she understood immediately why the Duke had summoned someone from outside his own household. A dress like this required not just skill, but patience, and a willingness to work for hours without complaint, until every detail matched perfectly. "This will take time, Your Grace," she said honestly. "Weeks, at least. Perhaps longer, if the lacework proves as intricate as it appears in the portrait." "Time is not something I am short on," he said quietly. "It is the one thing this house has far too much of." Clara glanced up at him, studying the tired lines around his eyes, the stiff way he held his shoulders, as though carrying a weight only he could feel. "Your Grace, if I may ask, without pressing on matters you do not wish to discuss, why now? 2 years have passed. Why call for this dress today, rather than a month ago, or a year from now?" The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, though the curtains remained drawn, blocking any view of the gardens beyond. "There is an anniversary approaching," he said finally. "A date that matters more than most people in this house understand. I made a promise to my wife before she died, a promise I intend to keep, whatever it costs me. This dress is part of that promise." Clara wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what promise could possibly require an exact replica of a wedding gown 2 years after a wife's passing, but something in the Duke's expression told her the conversation had already gone as far as he was willing to allow. She nodded instead, and began laying out her tools, her needles, her thread, her small brass thimble worn smooth from years of use. Over the following days, a strange rhythm settled into the manor. Clara worked in the study each morning, carefully measuring the fragments of original fabric, sketching patterns on scraps of paper, testing threads against the ivory silk to find the closest possible match. The Duke often remained in the room while she worked, seated in a large chair near the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes simply staring into the flames, though Clara noticed he rarely turned the pages of whatever book he held. It was as though his presence there had less to do with reading, and more to do with simply being near the dress, as it slowly began to take shape beneath her hands. She learned, in small pieces gathered from careful observation and the occasional word from the household staff, that Isabel Ashworth had been beloved throughout the estate, known for her kindness toward the servants and her patience with tenants who struggled to pay their dues during hard seasons. She learned that her death had been sudden, officially recorded as a terrible accident, a fall from the cliffs along the eastern edge of the estate during a storm. And she learned that no one in the household spoke of that night willingly, not even Mrs. Doyle, who Clara noticed always found some excuse to leave the room whenever the subject drifted too close. One afternoon, while measuring the waistline of the half-finished bodice against the portrait's proportions, Clara noticed something odd. The fabric fragment she had been using as her primary reference had a small tear along one seam, hidden beneath a fold, the kind of tear that might come from fabric being pulled roughly, rather than simply worn with age. She turned it over carefully in her hands, studying the frayed edges, and felt a small chill settle over her, though she could not explain exactly why. "You seem troubled," the Duke said from his chair, watching her with the same quiet attentiveness he always carried while she worked. "It is nothing, Your Grace," Clara said quickly, setting the fragment aside. "Simply old fabric. It happens with age." He studied her a moment longer, as though weighing whether to press the matter, then returned his gaze to the fire without another word. That evening, after supper, Clara found herself unable to settle into sleep. The manor at night was a different creature entirely from the manor by day, filled with soft creaks and distant echoes that seemed far louder in the darkness than they ever did beneath the sun. She lay awake for what felt like hours, listening to the wind pressing against her window, until finally, unable to bear the stillness any longer, she rose and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, intending only to walk to the kitchen for a cup of warm milk to help her sleep. The corridor outside her room was dimly lit by a single lamp near the staircase, and Clara moved quietly, mindful not to wake the rest of the household. She had nearly reached the stairs when she noticed a faint light flickering from the far end of the hallway, in the direction of the west wing, the very section of the house the Duke had warned her so firmly to avoid. She should have turned away. She told herself later, many times, that she should have simply continued to the kitchen and forgotten what she saw. But curiosity, sharpened by 2 years of unanswered village rumors, and a warning that had only deepened her interest rather than dulled it, pulled her steps in the opposite direction. The corridor leading toward the west wing grew colder with every step, the elegant carpets giving way to bare stone floors, the warm lamplight fading into shadow. Clara could see, at the very end of the hall, a heavy wooden door slightly ajar, a thin line of candlelight spilling out from within. She crept closer, her heart pounding so loudly, she was certain it could be heard through the walls, and pressed her eye carefully to the gap in the door. Inside, the room was in disarray, filled with covered furniture draped in white sheets, like ghosts frozen mid-motion. At the center of the room stood a woman Clara did not recognize, her back turned, holding something small and delicate in her hands, something that caught the candlelight and glinted softly. The woman's shoulders shook slightly, as though she were crying, and she murmured words too soft for Clara to make out, words that sounded almost like an apology, whispered to someone who could no longer hear it. Clara's foot shifted against the stone floor, and a small creak echoed through the silent hallway. The woman inside the room went rigid, then turned sharply toward the door. Clara did not wait to see her face. She turned and fled back down the corridor, as quietly and quickly as her legs would carry her, her heart hammering, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts, not stopping until she was safely back inside her room, with the door shut firmly behind her. She spent the rest of the night sitting up in bed, staring at the closed door, waiting for footsteps that never came. By morning, exhaustion had finally pulled her into a restless, uneasy sleep, filled with fragmented images of candlelight and shadows, and a woman's shaking shoulders that she could not quite place, though something about the shape of her, the way she held herself, felt strangely, uncomfortably familiar. When Clara arrived at the study later that morning, later than she intended, the Duke looked up at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something sharper, more searching. "You look as though you did not sleep well, Miss Bennet," he said. "The house is unfamiliar to me still, Your Grace," Clara answered carefully, keeping her eyes on her sewing basket as she set it down. "It will take time to grow accustomed to its sounds." He studied her for a long moment, and Clara had the distinct uncomfortable feeling that he knew, somehow, that she was not telling him the whole truth. But he said nothing further, simply gestured toward the half-finished dress, laid carefully across the table, and the day's work began as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Yet as Clara threaded her needle and bent over the delicate lacework, her mind kept drifting back to the west wing, to the shaking shoulders of the unknown woman, to the small object glinting in her hands beneath the candlelight, and to the question that now refused to leave her thoughts no matter how firmly she tried to push it away. If Isabel Ashworth had truly died 2 years ago, then who was the woman crying alone in her locked, forbidden room in the middle of the night? Days passed, and Clara said nothing to anyone about what she had seen in the West Wing. She told herself, over and over, that it was not her place to pry into the private grief of a household that had already suffered so much loss. But the truth was simpler, and far less noble. She was afraid. Afraid of what she might uncover, and afraid of what it might cost her if she asked the wrong question to the wrong person. Still, the work continued, and with it came a strange, quiet closeness that grew between Clara and the Duke, one neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both seemed to feel all the same. He began arriving earlier to the study each morning, sometimes bringing a small pot of tea for them to share while she worked, and in the long, comfortable silences that stretched between them, Clara found herself studying him as carefully as she studied the delicate stitches of the dress. She noticed the way his expression softened whenever the fabric began to resemble the portrait more closely, and the way his voice grew rough whenever he spoke, even briefly, of the woman he had lost. One morning, as she carefully pinned lace along the sleeve of the bodice, a new visitor arrived at the manor, a tall, thin man with sharp cheekbones and a voice like dry paper, introduced to her simply as Gerald Finch, the estate's steward. He managed the household finances and the tenant accounts, a position of considerable trust, and from the moment he entered the study, Clara felt an immediate discomfort settle over her, though she could not name the reason. "So this is the seamstress everyone has been whispering about," Finch said, his eyes sweeping over the half-finished dress, with an expression Clara found difficult to read. "Remarkable work, truly. Though I confess, Your Grace, I do wonder at the wisdom of reopening old wounds so close to the anniversary. Grief has a way of growing sharper when it is given too much attention. My decisions regarding my own household are not yours to question, Finch," the Duke said, his tone cool enough that Clara felt the temperature of the room drop several degrees. "You were called here for the quarterly accounts, not for commentary on matters that do not concern you." Finch's smile did not waver, though something flickered briefly behind his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared, much like the flicker Clara had noticed in Mrs. Doyle's expression on her very first day. "Of course, Your Grace. Forgive my concern. I only wish to see this house find peace again, after everything it has endured." He bowed slightly and left the room, but Clara noticed the way his gaze lingered on the dress one final time, before the door closed behind him, a look that seemed less like sympathy and more like calculation. "You do not trust him," Clara said quietly, once they were alone again. The Duke was silent for a long moment, staring at the door Finch had just passed through. "Trust is a luxury I stopped affording most people in this house long ago," he said finally. "Finch has served my family for many years. He was close to my father, and he managed the estate's finances long before I inherited the title. I have no proof of any wrongdoing on his part, only instinct, and instinct is not something a duke can act upon without evidence." Clara thought of the woman in the West Wing, of the shaking shoulders and the whispered apology, and felt a strong urge to ask the Duke directly whether he knew who she was. But something in his guarded expression told her the moment was not right, that pushing too hard, too soon, might close a door that had only just begun to open between them. That evening, driven by a restlessness she could not quiet, Clara found herself once again drawn toward questions she knew she should leave alone. While the household staff prepared for supper, she slipped quietly into the small library adjoining the main hall, a room she had passed many times but never yet entered, hoping to find some record, some mention of Isabel Ashworth that might help her understand the strange atmosphere hanging over this house. The library was smaller than she expected, lined with shelves of ledgers and family records rather than novels or poetry. Clara moved carefully along the shelves, scanning the spines of thick leather-bound books, until her eyes fell upon a small wooden trunk tucked beneath a reading table near the window, its lid slightly ajar, as though someone had left it open in haste and never returned to close it properly. Inside, beneath a folded shawl that smelled faintly of lavender, Clara found a bundle of letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Her hands hesitated over them for a long moment, aware that she was crossing a line she had no right to cross, but curiosity, sharpened now by weeks of unanswered questions, won out over caution. She untied the ribbon carefully and began to read. The first several letters were tender and unremarkable, written between the Duke and Isabel during what appeared to be the early years of their courtship, filled with small affections and quiet promises of a shared future. Clara felt a pang of guilt reading such private words, But she pressed on, searching for something, anything, that might explain the strange fear that seemed to grip this entire household whenever the subject of the late Duchess arose. Near the bottom of the bundle, she found a letter unlike the others, written in a hand that shook slightly, the ink smudged in places as though tears had fallen upon the page before it dried. It was addressed not to the Duke, but to someone named only as my dearest friend, and as Clara read the words within it, her blood ran cold. I fear I am being watched more closely than I once believed. Gerald grows bolder in his demands, insisting that certain accounts remain unseen by Edmund's eyes, threatening consequences I dare not write plainly even in a private letter. I have tried to speak with my husband, but Gerald warns me that such conversations would only bring harm to those I love most. I do not know how much longer I can carry this weight alone. If anything should happen to me before I find the courage to speak the full truth, I beg whoever finds these words to know that my death, should it come suddenly, would not be an accident of storm or cliff, but the result of secrets I was never permitted to share. Clara's hands trembled so violently that the paper rustled loudly in the quiet library. She read the letter again, and then a third time, searching for some other explanation, some innocent interpretation that might soften the weight of what she had just discovered. But there was none. Isabel Ashworth had feared for her life before her death, and she had named, quite clearly, the man responsible for that fear. Gerald Finch. A sound from the corridor outside sent Clara scrambling to retie the ribbon and return the letters to the trunk, exactly as she had found them, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would betray her presence to whoever approached. She slipped out of the library just as a maid passed by carrying an armful of candles, offering Clara only a brief, uninterested glance before continuing down the hall. Clara returned to her room that night with her mind spinning, torn between the desperate need to tell the Duke what she had found and the fear of what such a revelation might unleash within a household already strained by grief and secrets. If Finch truly held some dark influence over this family, revealing what she knew too carelessly could put not only herself in danger, but the Duke as well, and perhaps even Oliver back in the village, should Finch discover the threat she posed and choose to act against her before she could speak. She thought of the woman in the West Wing once more, and a new, unsettling thought began to take shape in her mind, one she almost did not dare to consider. What if that woman was not a stranger mourning Isabel's memory, but someone connected far more directly to the truth hidden within those trembling letters? What if the accident on the cliffs had not claimed the life everyone believed it had? Clara did not sleep that night. She sat by her window, watching the dark shape of the West Wing across the courtyard, its shuttered windows revealing nothing, and she made a quiet, resolute decision. Whatever truth was buried within this manor, she would find it, carefully, patiently, one stitch at a time, just as she was piecing together the dress that had brought her here in the first place. She only hoped that whatever she uncovered would not cost her everything, before she had the chance to see the truth fully revealed. The following morning, Clara arrived at the study, with the letter's words still echoing in her mind, though she said nothing of what she had found. She busied herself instead with the delicate pearl work along the bodice, her fingers moving with practiced precision, even as her thoughts churned beneath the surface. The Duke noticed her distraction almost immediately. "You have been quiet today, Miss Bennet," he said, setting aside the ledger he had been pretending to read. "Quieter than usual, and that is saying something, given how little you speak of your own thoughts even on ordinary days." Clara hesitated, her needle paused mid-air. She had promised herself she would wait, that she would gather more certainty before speaking, but the weight of the secret had grown too heavy to carry alone through another long day. "Your Grace, may I ask you something delicate, without fear of overstepping?" "You may ask," he said, echoing the same careful permission Mrs. Doyle had once offered her. "The accident that took your wife's life," Clara said slowly, choosing each word with great care. "Was there ever any question, any doubt at all, that it happened exactly as it was recorded?" The Duke's face went still, the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from a sudden sharp tightening of old wounds. "Why would you ask such a thing?" Clara set down her needle, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since the conversation began. "Because I do not believe it was an accident, Your Grace. And I believe you may have suspected the same thing yourself, long before I ever arrived at this manor." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and somewhere beyond the heavy curtains, birds sang in the garden, as though the world outside remained entirely unaware of the tension gathering inside this quiet study. Finally, the Duke rose from his chair and walked slowly to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to let a thin line of daylight spill across the floor. 2 years ago, he said, his voice low and measured, as though he had rehearsed these words many times in the privacy of his own mind, but never once found the courage to speak them aloud. My wife told me she needed to discuss something urgent, something she could not put into a letter or a hurried conversation between household duties. We agreed to meet that evening along the eastern cliffs, a place we had walked together many times since our earliest days of courtship. A storm rolled in faster than either of us expected. I arrived late, delayed by estate business I now deeply regret attending to. When I reached the cliffs, she was already gone. His hands gripped the windowsill tightly, his knuckles pale against the dark wood. The official account states that she lost her footing in the storm, that the wind and rain made the cliff path treacherous, and that her death was a terrible, tragic accident. I told myself that story for 2 years, Miss Bennet, because the alternative was unbearable. But I never stopped wondering what she wished to tell me that night. I never stopped wondering whether someone else knew of our meeting, and whether that same person made certain she never had the chance to speak. Clara rose from her seat and approached him slowly, the letter's careful words burning in her memory. Your Grace, I must tell you what I found. I did not go looking for it intentionally, but once I found it, I could not simply set it aside and pretend I had seen nothing. She told him everything then, the letters hidden in the small wooden trunk, the trembling handwriting, the fear Isabel had confided to an unnamed friend, and the name written clearly within those final desperate lines. She watched the Duke's face shift from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to a cold, quiet fury, unlike anything she had yet seen from him. Finch, he said, the name leaving his mouth like something bitter he could barely stand to taste. I trusted that man with the very foundation of this estate. My father trusted him before me. And you are telling me he threatened my wife into silence, and that silence may have cost her life. I cannot prove what happened on that cliff, Your Grace, Clara said carefully. The letter speaks only of fear, of secrets regarding the estate's accounts that Isabel was forbidden to reveal. But if she intended to break that silence the very night she died, and if Finch learned of her intentions beforehand, then the timing is far too troubling to dismiss as simple coincidence. The Duke was silent for a long moment, staring out at the garden beyond the window, his jaw tight with a restrained anger that seemed to vibrate through the entire room. There is something else you should know, Miss Bennet, he said finally, turning back to face her. Something I have kept hidden even from my own staff, for fear of what its discovery might unleash. Clara waited, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. The woman you saw in the West Wing, he said quietly. Her name is Margaret. She was Isabel's personal companion, closer to her than a sister in every way that mattered. After my wife's death, Margaret came to me in a state of terrible distress, insisting that Isabel had confided fears to her in the weeks before she died. Fears about the estate's finances, and about Finch's growing control over accounts that should never have passed through his hands without my direct knowledge. I did not fully believe her at the time. Grief, I told myself, was speaking louder than reason. I gave her a place to stay quietly within the West Wing, away from the rest of the household, both to protect her from whatever danger she believed she faced, and, I confess with shame, to keep her grief contained, where it would not disturb the fragile peace I had convinced myself I needed. She has been living there this entire time, Clara said softly, understanding now the shaking shoulders, the whispered apology, the careful secrecy surrounding that entire wing of the manor. She rarely leaves those rooms, the Duke confirmed. She fears Finch will act against her if he learns she remains here, believing whatever secrets Isabel shared with her, before her death, remain a danger to him even now. I have wondered, more than once, whether I was protecting her, or simply hiding my own unwillingness to confront a truth I was not yet ready to face. Clara felt the pieces of this strange, tragic puzzle, beginning to align into something clearer, something far more dangerous than she had imagined when she first climbed into that black carriage weeks ago. Your Grace, if Margaret knows more of what Isabel intended to reveal that night, perhaps it is time she was finally asked directly, rather than left alone with her fear in a locked and shuttered room. The Duke considered this for a long moment, before nodding slowly. You are right, Miss Bennet. I have allowed fear to dictate the silence of this house for far too long. Perhaps it is time that silence finally ended. He moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to look at her with an expression she had not yet seen from him, something that mingled gratitude with a deep, aching vulnerability. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for your honesty, and for your courage in bringing this to me, even knowing the risk it carried for you as well." Clara felt warmth rise in her chest at his words, though she quickly reminded herself that gratitude, however genuine, did not erase the very real danger now gathering around them both. If Finch had been willing to silence a duchess to protect his secrets, there was little reason to believe he would hesitate to silence a village seamstress who had stumbled, quite by accident, into the very heart of his deception. That afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent behind the manor's tall gray towers, the Duke led Clara personally toward the west wing, his steps steady and resolute despite the tension visible in every line of his posture. The corridor felt different in daylight, less menacing than it had during her frightened midnight retreat, though the cold, bare stone floors still carried an unmistakable chill that seemed to seep into her very bones. He knocked gently upon the same heavy wooden door Clara had glimpsed weeks earlier, calling softly through the wood. "Margaret, it is Edmund. I have someone with me, someone I believe you can trust. We must speak, all three of us, about Isabel, and about the truth we have both been too afraid to face." For a long moment, there was only silence from within. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, revealing a woman with tired eyes and a face lined by 2 years of grief and isolation. The same woman Clara had glimpsed through the gap in the door weeks before, her shoulders no longer shaking, but her expression heavy with a fear that had clearly never once loosened its grip upon her. "Edmund," Margaret whispered, her gaze flickering nervously between the Duke and Clara. "What has happened? Why now, after all this time?" "Because a brave woman found the courage to uncover what I was too afraid to search for myself," the Duke said, gesturing gently toward Clara. "And because I believe, Margaret, that it is finally time we spoke the truth. Isabel never had the chance to speak herself." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and after a long, trembling breath, she stepped aside, allowing them both into the small, dimly lit room, where she had spent 2 long years hiding from a truth that had haunted every quiet hour of her existence. "There is much you do not know," she said softly, closing the door carefully behind them. "And once I tell you, Edmund, there will be no turning back from what must come next." Margaret gestured for them to sit, though the only seating in the small, sparsely furnished room consisted of a single worn chair and the edge of a narrow bed. Clara remained standing near the door, sensing that whatever was about to be shared belonged first and most painfully to the Duke, and she did not wish to intrude further upon a moment that had waited 2 long years to arrive. "Isabel came to me many months before her death. Deeply troubled," Margaret began, her voice steady now despite the tremor Clara had witnessed in her earlier through the gap in the door. She had discovered discrepancies in the estate's ledgers, small at first, easy enough to dismiss as clerical error. But the more she looked, the more she found. Money meant for tenant relief during the hard winters was being redirected. Funds set aside for repairs to the tenant cottages simply vanished, recorded on paper, but never spent where they were claimed to be spent. She suspected Gerald Finch from the very beginning, given his sole authority over those particular accounts, but she had no proof strong enough to bring before you, Edmund, and she feared what accusing a man so trusted by your late father might do to the stability of this household. "Why did she not come to me the moment she suspected something was wrong?" the Duke asked, his voice tight with a grief that had clearly sharpened into something closer to anger. "Because Finch discovered her suspicions before she could act on them," Margaret said quietly. "He confronted her privately, warned her that accusations against him, without solid proof, would only damage her own reputation and yours. That people would say the young Duchess was meddling in matters she did not understand. He threatened, more subtly than outright, that certain tenants who depended on Finch's goodwill for leniency during difficult seasons might suddenly find that goodwill withdrawn, should Isabel continue digging into affairs that were not, in his words, a woman's proper concern." Clara felt anger rise in her own chest at the thought of such quiet, calculated cruelty, the kind that left no obvious mark yet caused damage, every bit as real as any open confrontation. She continued searching anyway, Margaret continued, quietly, carefully, gathering what proof she could, without drawing further suspicion. In the weeks before her death, She told me she had finally found something significant. Records hidden among older ledgers that Finch believed long forgotten. Proof that funds had been diverted for years, not merely months, likely stretching back even before your father passed the title to you, Edmund. She intended to bring this proof to you directly, on the very night she died. The meeting at the cliffs, the Duke said slowly, understanding, dawning across his face like a shadow deepening at dusk. She asked to meet you there because it was private, away from the household staff, away from anyone who might overhear or interrupt, Margaret confirmed. She carried the proof with her, that evening, Edmund. I begged her to wait, to bring it to you somewhere safer, somewhere less exposed, but she was determined to finally end the secrecy that had weighed on her for so long. I have believed, every single day since her death, that Finch somehow learned of her intentions and followed her that night. I have no proof of this. I have only my own conviction, sharpened by fear I have never found the courage to voice aloud, until this very moment. Clara stepped forward gently. Margaret, do you know what became of the proof Isabel carried that night? The records she found? Margaret shook her head slowly. They were never recovered. I searched her belongings myself, in the days following her death. Quietly, without drawing attention. I found nothing. If she carried them to the cliffs that evening, either they were lost in the storm, swept away entirely, or someone else ensured they would never be found again. A heavy silence settled over the small room, broken only by the soft crackle of a low fire in the corner hearth. The Duke's expression had hardened into something Clara had not yet witnessed from him. A cold, focused resolve that replaced the weary grief he had carried since the very first day she arrived at this manor. If such records once existed, he said finally, then perhaps copies or fragments remain somewhere within this estate, overlooked by Finch, precisely because he believes the matter long buried alongside my wife. Isabel was careful, Margaret. She would not have relied on a single copy of something so important, not if she understood the danger she faced in bringing it forward. Where would she have kept such things hidden? Clara asked. Somewhere Finch would never think to search, yet somewhere she herself could access easily, should she need to retrieve them quickly. Margaret's eyes widened slightly, a memory surfacing behind her tired gaze. Her sewing room, she said suddenly. Isabel kept a small private sewing room in the east wing, rarely used by anyone else in the household, myself included. She often said it was the one place in this entire manor where she felt truly free to think without interruption. If she hid anything important, anywhere in this house, I believe that room is the most likely place to look. The Duke rose immediately, a renewed sense of purpose steadying his previously weary posture. Then that is where we begin. Tonight, once the household has settled and Finch has returned to his own quarters for the evening. Your Grace, Clara said carefully. If Finch discovers we are searching that room, or worse, if he learns that Margaret has finally spoken the truth she has carried alone for 2 years, the danger to all of us will increase considerably. We must move with great caution. I am aware of the risk, Miss Bennet, the Duke said, his jaw set firmly, but I have allowed fear and caution to rule this household for 2 long years already, and it has cost me nothing but continued grief and unanswered questions. I am done waiting for certainty before I act. Tonight, we search my wife's sewing room, and whatever we find, we will finally bring the truth of her death into the light, whatever the cost. Margaret nodded slowly, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides. I will come with you. I owe Isabel that much. After 2 years of silence I should never have kept for so long. As the 3 of them made their plans for the evening ahead, carefully avoiding the notice of any household staff who might report unusual movement to Finch, Clara felt a mixture of fear and determination settle deep within her chest. She thought of Oliver, resting quietly back in the village cottage, and hoped desperately that whatever danger she was now stepping into would not follow her home to threaten the one person in the world she loved most. But she thought also of Isabel Ashworth, a woman she had never met, yet had come to know intimately through careful stitches and desperate hidden letters. A woman who had died, carrying a truth she never had the chance to speak aloud. Clara owed her that truth now, just as much as Margaret and the Duke did, and she was determined, whatever the danger, to see it finally brought into the light. That evening, as the last candles were extinguished throughout the manor and the household staff retired to their quarters for the night, Clara waited quietly in her room, listening for the soft, careful knock that would signal it was time to begin their search. When it finally came, Gentle and deliberate against her door, she rose immediately, wrapped a dark shawl around her shoulders, and slipped out into the shadowed corridor, ready to finally uncover the truth that had waited 2 long years within the walls of this grieving, secretive house. The east wing, unlike the neglected shadows of the west, remained well maintained, though clearly less frequently visited than the main portions of the house. Dust lay thin but noticeable along the corridor's decorative moldings, and the air carried the faint, dry scent of a room left closed for far too long. The Duke led the way, a single lantern held low to keep its light from spilling too brightly beneath door frames or through curtained windows, with Margaret close behind him and Clara following at the rear, her heart pounding steadily with every careful step. Isabel's sewing room sat at the very end of the corridor, a modest door far less grand than Clara expected from a duchess's private chamber, as though Isabel herself had preferred simplicity over the ornate grandeur that marked the rest of the manor. The Duke produced a small key from his coat pocket, his hand trembling slightly as he fitted it into the lock. "I have not entered this room since her death," he admitted quietly, pausing before turning the key. "I could never bring myself to disturb it." The door opened with a soft, reluctant creak, revealing a small chamber, exactly as Clara might have imagined for a woman of Isabel's gentle reputation. A modest sewing table sat beneath the room's single window, scattered still with spools of thread long faded by dust, and shelves along one wall held neatly folded fabrics that had clearly not been touched in 2 full years. A soft, melancholy stillness hung over everything, as though the room itself had been waiting patiently for someone to finally return. "Where should we begin looking?" Clara asked softly, setting her own small candle carefully upon the sewing table. Margaret moved toward a low wooden cabinet tucked beneath the window seat, running her fingers along its edges with the familiarity of someone who had spent many quiet afternoons in this very room alongside its former occupant. Isabel kept small personal items here, things she did not wish the household staff to catalog or discuss. It seems the most sensible place to search first. The cabinet was unlocked, its contents undisturbed by anyone in the 2 years since Isabel's death. Clara knelt beside Margaret, carefully lifting out folded scraps of fabric, small tins of buttons, and neatly wound spools of colored thread, searching for anything that might hold papers or hidden documents among the ordinary tools of a seamstress's private hobby. It was Clara's own trained eye, familiar with the particular weight and texture of fabric after years spent working with her hands, that finally noticed something unusual. A folded piece of pale blue silk, tucked near the very bottom of the cabinet, felt heavier and stiffer than fabric alone should feel. "Your Grace," she said quietly, lifting the fabric carefully and unfolding it with steady hands. Inside, carefully wrapped and protected from damage, lay a small bundle of papers, their edges slightly yellowed, but their contents still perfectly legible. The Duke took them with visibly shaking hands, unfolding the first page beneath the soft glow of the lantern light. "These are copies of the estate ledgers," he said slowly, his eyes scanning the careful handwriting that filled each page, handwriting Clara recognized immediately from the tender early letters she had read in the library trunk. Isabel's own notes, comparing recorded expenditures against actual disbursements to the tenants. "The discrepancies span years, Margaret, exactly as you said. Thousands of pounds, diverted quietly, disguised within accounts that appeared, on the surface, entirely legitimate." "There is more," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, as she pulled a second, smaller sheet from beneath the first bundle. "A letter, Edmund, written in her own hand, dated the very morning of her death." The Duke's hands trembled visibly now as he unfolded the final letter, and Clara watched his face carefully as he read the words his late wife had written on the very last morning of her life. Words meant, quite clearly, to be discovered only if something happened to prevent her from delivering them in person. "If you are reading this," he read aloud, his voice breaking slightly on each word, "then something has gone wrong tonight, and I fear the worst has come to pass. Gerald Finch has stolen from this estate for years, hiding his theft behind careful accounting and the trust our family placed in him without question. I go tonight to finally show you proof, my dearest Edmund, though I confess I am afraid, more afraid than I have allowed myself to admit even to Margaret. If I do not return safely, know that I loved you completely, and that I would rather face whatever danger tonight holds than continue living beneath the weight of a secret I was never meant to carry alone." The room fell into a heavy, aching silence as the Duke lowered the letter, his shoulders shaking with a grief he had clearly held tightly restrained for 2 long years, finally breaking free beneath the undeniable weight of his wife's own final words. She knew, he whispered. She knew she might be walking into danger that very night, and she went anyway, because she trusted that the truth mattered more than her own safety. Clara placed a gentle hand upon his arm, offering what small comfort she could in a moment far too heavy for words alone. Margaret wept quietly beside them, 2 years of guarded silence finally breaking apart into open grief. It was the sudden, sharp creak of the corridor floorboards outside that pulled all 3 of them back into the present, every muscle tensing at once. "Someone is coming," Clara whispered urgently, quickly folding the ledger pages and Isabel's final letter back into their protective silk wrapping. The Duke moved swiftly to extinguish the lantern, plunging the small room into near-total darkness, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the single window. Footsteps grew louder in the corridor outside, slow and deliberate, pausing directly outside the sewing room door. The door handle turned slowly. Clara's heart pounded so violently, she was certain it could be heard through the silence, and beside her, she felt Margaret go rigid with fear. The door swung open, revealing a tall, familiar silhouette framed against the dim corridor light beyond. "I thought I heard voices," Gerald Finch said quietly, stepping into the room with a small lamp of his own, held steady in one hand, his sharp eyes sweeping across the 3 figures gathered within Isabel's long-abandoned sewing chamber. "How curious to find you all here, at such a late hour, in a room that has remained locked for 2 entire years." The Duke stepped forward immediately, positioning himself between Finch and the 2 women, the folded papers held tightly, protectively, against his chest. "This is not your concern, Finch. I would advise you to return to your quarters immediately." Finch's gaze drifted deliberately toward the bundle of papers clutched in the Duke's hand, and something cold and calculating settled behind his sharp eyes, the polite mask he had worn so carefully for years, finally beginning to slip away entirely. "I see you have finally found what my late mistress spent so many careful months searching for," he said softly. "How unfortunate for all of you, that you found it 2 years too late to change anything at all." The words hung in the cold night air, like a confession, spoken too plainly to ever be taken back. Finch seemed to realize it himself a moment later, his expression tightening as though he wished he could pull the sentence back into his mouth. But the damage had already been done, and there was no undoing what had just been revealed. "Too late to change anything," the Duke repeated slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. "You speak as though you already know precisely what these papers contain, Finch, as though you have known for quite some time exactly what my wife discovered before she died." Finch's composure cracked further, his sharp features twisting into something far less controlled than the polished steward Clara had first met in the study weeks earlier. "Your wife," he said bitterly, "was determined to destroy everything I had carefully built over more than 20 years of loyal service to this family. Your father trusted me with these accounts long before you ever wore that title, Edmund. I managed them faithfully for years, before allowing myself certain small comforts I felt I had rightfully earned after decades of thankless work managing an estate that never once thought to reward my loyalty beyond the meager wages of a steward's position." "You call theft a small comfort?" the Duke demanded, his voice rising now with a fury that had clearly been building for 2 long years, finally given a target worthy of its full weight. "You call the betrayal of tenants who trusted this estate to protect them during hard winters a comfort you rightfully earned?" "I call it survival," Finch snapped back, his careful mask now fully abandoned. "And when your wife threatened to expose everything I had built, everything I had risked, I did what any man in my position would have done. I warned her. I gave her every opportunity to abandon her foolish crusade and return quietly to the comfortable ignorance a duchess is supposed to enjoy." "And when she refused?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling, but steady, with a courage Clara had not seen from her until this very moment. Finch's silence answered the question more clearly than any words could have. Clara felt a cold, sick certainty settle into her stomach as she watched the man's expression, the flicker of something dark and unrepentant behind his sharp, calculating eyes. "You followed her to the cliffs that night," the Duke said, his voice barely above a whisper now, each word carrying the full weight of 2 years of unanswered grief, finally finding its target. "You followed her, and when she refused to give up the proof she carried, you ensured she never had the chance to deliver it to me. The storm did the rest of the work for me, Finch said coldly, and the casual cruelty in his voice sent a fresh wave of horror through the small, dark room. I only made certain she could not walk away from that cliff edge before the wind and rain finished what began as a simple conversation gone wrong. The Duke moved forward with such sudden fury that Clara instinctively stepped back, pulling Margaret with her toward the safety of the far wall. But Finch was already retreating toward the doorway, his earlier confidence rapidly dissolving into something closer to panic, now that his careful secret had finally, irreversibly, been spoken aloud. "You will not leave this room to spread more lies, Finch," the Duke said, his voice hard as stone. "I have no intention of staying to be accused of something you cannot possibly prove without my own confession." Finch shot back, already moving swiftly toward the corridor beyond. "And a confession, Your Grace, is something you will find considerably more difficult to obtain than you might currently believe." He turned and fled into the darkened corridor, his footsteps echoing rapidly against the stone floor as he disappeared into the depths of the sleeping manor. The Duke moved to follow immediately, but Clara caught his arm, her voice urgent. "Your Grace, wait. If you chase him alone into a house this large and this dark, he may find a way to slip past you entirely, or worse, he may find a way to destroy whatever other evidence might still remain hidden somewhere within this estate. We must think carefully, not simply react in anger." The Duke's chest heaved with barely restrained fury, but he forced himself to pause, recognizing the sense in Clara's steady, measured words even through the haze of 2 years of long-buried grief, finally breaking free all at once. "You are right," he said, breathing hard, "but we cannot allow him to escape this house entirely. If he flees before morning, we may never have another chance to bring him properly to justice for what he has done." "Then we must move quickly, but carefully," Clara said. "Margaret, do you know if there is any way to secure the manor's main gates during the night? Some way to prevent a carriage or horse from leaving the grounds unnoticed?" Margaret nodded quickly, wiping tears from her cheeks as her earlier fear hardened into something closer to determined resolve. "The stable master sleeps in quarters near the main gate. If we wake him now and explain the urgency, he can ensure no horse leaves the grounds without proper authority from His Grace himself. But go to him now," the Duke instructed. "Clara, I need you to find Mrs. Doyle and alert her quietly, without raising alarm throughout the rest of the household staff. She has served this family long enough to understand the gravity of what we now face, and her discretion will be essential in the hours ahead." The three of them separated quickly, moving through the dark, sleeping corridors of the manor with a shared sense of urgent purpose that had replaced the fear and hesitation of the past several weeks entirely. Clara found Mrs. Doyle's quarters near the kitchen wing and knocked softly but insistently until the housekeeper answered, still wrapped in a heavy nightrobe, her sharp eyes immediately alert to the seriousness written plainly across Clara's face. "What has happened?" Mrs. Doyle asked immediately, any trace of her usual guarded composure falling away entirely. "Gerald Finch," Clara said quickly. "He has confessed, in front of His Grace himself, to a terrible crime against this family, one connected directly to the Duchess's death 2 years ago. He has fled deeper into the manor, and we must ensure he does not escape before morning." Mrs. Doyle's face went pale, but she recovered quickly. Decades of quiet service to this family evidently teaching her exactly how to respond when a crisis finally, truly arrived. "I will alert the remaining staff quietly and ensure every exit from the main house is watched carefully, until His Grace can properly address the matter. You should return to His Grace immediately, Miss Bennet. A house this large holds far too many places for a desperate man to hide, and far too many dangers for those searching for him alone." Clara nodded and hurried back through the darkened corridors, her heart still pounding heavily, praying silently that the Duke had not encountered Finch again, without her presence to offer whatever small measure of caution and clear thinking she could provide. As she rounded a final corner near the main staircase, a sudden, sharp cry echoed from somewhere above, followed immediately by the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps and something heavy crashing against the floor. Clara's blood ran cold, and without a single moment of hesitation, she gathered her skirts and ran toward the sound as quickly as her legs could carry her, praying desperately that whatever had happened, the Duke remained safe enough for her to still make a difference. Clara reached the top of the staircase to find the Duke standing near the entrance to the west wing, breathing hard, one hand braced against the wall, while Finch lay sprawled awkwardly upon the floor a short distance away, having apparently lost his footing in his desperate attempt to flee through the unfamiliar darkness of the corridor. A small side table lay overturned beside him, an ornamental vase shattered across the stone floor in scattered pieces. "Your Grace," Clara gasped, hurrying toward him. "Are you injured?" "I am unharmed," the Duke said quickly, though his breathing remained heavy from the exertion of the brief pursuit. He tried to flee toward the west wing, thinking perhaps to lose himself among its shuttered rooms, but the darkness proved as much an obstacle to him as it was meant to be an advantage. Finch groaned softly from the floor, clutching at his ankle, his earlier bravado entirely extinguished now that his escape had failed so completely. Several members of the household staff arrived moments later, alerted by Mrs. Doyle, carrying lanterns that finally banished the oppressive darkness from the corridor entirely. "Secure him," the Duke instructed firmly, and two of the sturdier stable hands moved forward immediately to restrain Finch, who offered no further resistance, the fight having gone out of him entirely, the moment his own confession had been overheard by more than the small circle originally gathered in Isabel's sewing room. "You cannot possibly believe the word of a grieving companion and a village seamstress over my own decades of service to this family," Finch protested weakly, though even his own voice carried little real conviction behind the words. "I do not need to rely on their word alone," the Duke said coldly, holding up the bundle of papers still clutched tightly in his hand. "My wife's own careful records, gathered long before her death, alongside the confession you spoke so freely, once you believed yourself safely alone, with only 3 witnesses to hear it. You forgot, Finch, that voices carry further in a quiet house at night than you might have wished, and that guilt, once spoken aloud, cannot simply be unspoken again." By morning, word had spread quietly but thoroughly throughout the estate that Gerald Finch had been formally handed over to the proper authorities, charged with the theft of estate funds spanning many years, and facing serious questions regarding his role in the tragic death of the late Duchess Isabel Ashworth 2 years prior. The investigation that followed, aided considerably by Isabel's own carefully preserved records, confirmed what Margaret, Clara, and the Duke had already come to understand that long, difficult night. Finch had indeed followed Isabel to the cliffs, had confronted her one final time, in a desperate attempt to silence her forever, and had allowed the storm to conceal the true nature of what had truly happened that terrible evening. Justice, when it finally arrived, brought no true celebration to Ashworth Manor, for no verdict could ever fully restore what had been lost 2 years earlier. But it brought something the household had not known in a very long time, a quiet, settling sense of peace, as though the manor itself could finally exhale after holding its breath for 2 long, difficult years. Margaret emerged slowly from her self-imposed isolation in the West Wing in the weeks that followed, gradually rejoining the household she had once loved, no longer burdened by fear of a man who could no longer threaten her silence. The shuttered windows of the West Wing were finally opened once more, sunlight pouring into rooms that had been kept dark for far too long, and Clara noticed the entire manor seemed to breathe more easily with each passing day, as though the truth itself had lifted a weight from every corridor and chamber within its walls. The dress, too, finally neared completion during those quieter weeks that followed, each stitch now carrying a different weight than it had when Clara first began the delicate, painstaking work. What had begun as a strange and mysterious commission had become, in the end, something closer to an act of devotion, a careful tribute to a woman whose courage and love had ultimately brought her killer to justice, even 2 years after her death. On the morning of the anniversary the Duke had spoken of so many weeks earlier, Clara presented the finished gown, laid carefully across a table in the same study where their strange journey had first begun. Every pearl was placed exactly as it appeared in the old portrait, every fold of lace recreated with a precision that made even Clara's own experienced eye struggle to distinguish her work from the original garment Isabel had once worn on her wedding day. The Duke stood before the finished dress for a long, silent moment, his eyes glistening with emotions Clara had come to recognize well during her weeks within these walls, a grief that had finally found room to soften, tempered now by a gratitude and a peace that had been entirely absent when she first arrived at this manor. "This was the promise," he said quietly, running his fingers gently along the delicate lace sleeve. "Isabel once told me, in a rare moment of quiet reflection before her death, that she wished for her wedding dress to be remade someday, not as a relic of mourning, but as a symbol that love, once given freely and truly, never truly disappears, no matter what darkness might try to claim it. I did not fully understand her meaning at the time. I believe I finally understand it now. He turned to face Clara directly, his expression carrying a warmth she had not seen from him during those first difficult, guarded days of her arrival. You have given me far more than a beautifully recreated dress, Miss Bennet. You have given this house its truth back, and in doing so, you have given me the chance to finally grieve properly, rather than remaining trapped within 2 years of unanswered fear and suspicion. I only found what was already waiting to be found, Your Grace, Clara said softly. The courage belonged to Isabel herself, and to Margaret, who carried her secret alone, for far longer than anyone should ever be asked to bear such a weight. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something new and tentative flickering behind his tired, grateful eyes. Perhaps, he said slowly, but courage of a different kind was required to uncover it, and to bring it forward despite the very real danger it placed upon you as well. I find myself deeply in your debt, Clara, in ways that a simple payment for your work could never fully repay. Clara felt warmth rise in her cheeks under the weight of his gaze, a warmth she had felt building slowly over the many quiet weeks they had spent together in this very study, watching a dress take shape beneath her careful hands, while something else, something far more unexpected, had quietly taken shape between them as well. The payment the Duke provided for the finished gown was, exactly as promised, more generous than anything Clara had ever earned in her life, enough to pay for every remedy Oliver could possibly need, enough to repair the small cottage roof that had leaked through every rainy season for as long as she could remember, and enough, still, to leave a comfortable sum set carefully aside, for whatever the future might bring. Yet when Clara finally returned to her village, carrying that small fortune tucked safely within her sewing basket, she found that the weeks spent at Ashworth Manor had changed far more within her than simply her finances alone. Oliver's fever, thankfully, had already begun to break under Mrs. Doyle's careful attention during her absence, and within days of Clara's return, proper medicine and rest restored the color to his cheeks and the strength to his small, thin limbs. He listened, wide-eyed, as Clara recounted a carefully softened version of her time at the manor, one that spared him the more frightening details, while still capturing the wonder of towering stone halls and gardens more beautiful than anything either of them had ever imagined. "Will you go back?" Oliver asked one evening, several weeks after her return, as Clara sat mending a small tear in his favorite shirt, beside the warm glow of their newly repaired hearth. Clara paused, her needle held still between careful fingers, and found herself unable to fully answer the question, for the truth was, she did not entirely know. A letter had arrived just that morning, bearing the same familiar crest she had once found so intimidating, though its message this time carried none of the mystery or urgency of that very first summons weeks earlier. The Duke wished simply to know how she fared, whether Oliver's health had improved, and whether she might consider returning to the manor sometime soon, not for another commission, but simply to visit, as a guest rather than a hired seamstress. She had read the letter 3 times already, each time feeling a small, warm flutter settle beneath her ribs that she recognized, with growing certainty, as something far beyond simple gratitude for a generous payment long since delivered. "Perhaps," she told Oliver finally, folding the mended shirt carefully and setting it aside. "I believe, little brother, that this particular story may not be entirely finished just yet." In the months that followed, Clara did return to Ashworth Manor, first as an occasional guest, and later, as her visits grew more frequent, and the warmth between herself and Edmund deepened into something neither of them any longer felt the need to hide or deny. As someone whose presence within those gray stone walls felt less like a temporary arrangement and more like the quiet, gradual beginning of a shared future, neither of them could have predicted on the strange, uncertain morning that letter first arrived at her cottage door. Margaret remained at the manor as well, no longer hidden away in the shuttered west wing, but living openly now, as a valued and beloved member of the household, finally free from the fear that had governed her every waking hour for 2 long years. Mrs. Doyle continued her steady, watchful service to the family, her guarded composure softening, ever so slightly, into something closer to genuine warmth whenever Clara's carriage arrived at the manor gates. The dress itself, The very reason Clara had first been summoned to that grand, imposing house on the hill found its final resting place not folded away in some forgotten trunk, but displayed with quiet reverence within a small memorial alcove the Duke had commissioned near Isabel's favorite garden path, a place where sunlight fell gently each morning across delicate lace and carefully placed pearls, a tribute not to grief alone, but to a courage and love that had ultimately triumphed over deception and darkness, even 2 long years after it had first been silenced. Clara often visited that quiet alcove during her stays at the manor, sometimes alone, sometimes with Edmund beside her, and she found, each time, a deep and settled peace in knowing that her own careful, patient work had played some small part in finally allowing that courage to be properly honored, rather than buried alongside secrets that should never have been kept in the first place. The village whispered new rumors now about the poor seamstress once summoned so mysteriously to the Duke's grand manor, though these rumors carried none of the fear or dark speculation of that very first strange request. Instead, they spoke softly of quiet visits and blossoming affection, of a Duke who had finally found his way back to genuine warmth after 2 years lost in grief, and of a humble village seamstress whose skill, courage, and kindness had somehow, against every possible expectation, found a place within the heart of Ashworth Manor that no fortune or title could ever have purchased on its own. And Clara, when she thought back on that very first frightened morning, the sealed letter, the black carriage, and the strange, impossible request that had brought her through those tall iron gates, found herself deeply grateful. Not simply for the fortune that had changed her family's circumstances so completely, but for the truth she had helped uncover, the friendship she had found in Margaret's quiet courage, and the unexpected, gentle love that had grown slowly and steadily from the most unlikely beginning she could ever have imagined. Some doors, she had learned, were locked not to hide shameful secrets alone, but sometimes to protect a truth too fragile and too important to be exposed before its proper time. And some strange requests, however frightening they first appeared, carried within them the quiet possibility of an entirely new beginning, waiting patiently to be stitched together, one careful thread at a time.